Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe hosts talks with U.S. President Donald Trump in Florida after their fifth face-to-face meeting. Could Mr. Abe win U.S. trade concessions and take Japan out of the diplomatic hold in the likely DPRK-US summit? And the Chinese Navy carry out live military exercises in the Taiwan Strait after reports of a push for independence from local groups and the island's authorities. What's at stake for the future of the island? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our show today in Florida, where Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe meets U.S. President Donald Trump. Abe is in the U.S. for 2 days of meetings. The two leaders are talking about trade and tensions in the Korean Peninsula. The bilateral ties still face some challenges, to say the least, though the two leaders had many interactions after Mr. Trump took office last year.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is no stranger to the so-called Winter White House. U.S. President Donald Trump hosted Abe at his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida back in February of 2017. And Abe hosted the American leader in Tokyo later that year.
A lot of great work and great friendships have been built.
The White House says Trump has met and spoken with Abe more than any other leader. Indeed, they have a lot to discuss.
We've also started talking to North Korea directly. We have had direct talks at very high levels, extremely high levels, with North Korea. And I really believe there's a lot of goodwill, a lot of good things are happening.
This week's meeting is their first since Trump accepted an invitation by the North's Kim Jong-un to meet face-to-face. Japan has offered to join that conversation. Analysts say that's unlikely. Regionally, Japan has arguably taken the hardest line against the DPRK. Whereas the new government in Seoul favors intra-Korean talks and exchanges, Abe doesn't trust Kim.
I will confirm how we will continue to apply maximum pressure on North Korea as we work towards achieving the irreversible, completely verifiable nuclear and missile disarmament process.
But recent diplomatic overtures, including Kim's visit to Beijing and his upcoming talks with South Korea's Moon Jae-in, risk leaving Tokyo out of the equation. Abe is said to worry that Washington will focus its talks with Pyongyang on intercontinental ballistic missiles that threaten the U.S. and will overlook the short and medium-range arsenal pointed right at Japan. The other big issue is trade. Japan is among the few American allies directly impacted by recent U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, but so far not exempt. Tokyo's economic surplus over Washington may absorb some of that, but only for so long. Trump may use the tariffs as leverage to push Abe into bilateral free trade talks. The Japanese leader favors a multinational approach, namely the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership.
For more on Mr. Abe's visit to the United States, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Rong Ying, who is the Vice President of CIIS, the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Of course, you have been serving in Japan from the Chinese side for 5 years over there. We would like to hear your expertise. In Washington, D.C., we have Douglas Paul, Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome as well, Mr. Paul. Also joining us in D.C., we have Yoshikazu Kato, a research fellow of the Chahar Institute, who's also a columnist for the New York Times Chinese web edition. Welcome to you. Let me begin with you, Mr. Kato. Do you think on the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, Prime Minister Abe be able to get his meanings crossed to the U.S. side? Do you think he has already got enough promise from the other side about Japan's concerns this time?
I think at this moment, our Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is trying to assure Japan and the United States we could be together 100%. This is the first point. And I think because we are seeing that upcoming event, the summit between Mr. Trump and Kim Jong-un. And Shinzo Abe wants Mr. Trump to raise up the abduction issue. Because Japanese public, we are really concerned about abduction issues. So I think now, under the relatively political turmoil in domestic, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is trying to convince Mr. Trump to raise up this issue and promoting comprehensive resolution on the peninsula issue.
Okay, comprehensive probably is the key word here. Mr. Paul, of course, having the concerns being considered by the U.S. side, coming from the allies, it's important for the United States, but at the same time, carrying too many burdens and issues on the shoulder for a future summit with North Korea could also be very challenging to reach any result. So how is the U.S. going to weigh that, given what we have right now, the Japan Prime Minister meeting the U.S. President?
Well, the United States has to weigh the Japanese concerns very seriously. Not only does Japan have itself well within the range of many of North Korea's older and newer capabilities to inflict damage, but also it's the home for our facilities in the Far East, in Okinawa and on the Kyushu and Honshu islands of Japan. So these are really important considerations that will have to be brought to the table when President Trump meets with Kim Jong-un.
We understand, Mr. Rong,
yes,
now that the timetable is likely to be set, if not early June, probably even earlier than that. That's according to some of the media reports, which has also been confirmed by President Trump through his tweets and also his press conference with the Prime Minister Abe in Washington. So, given the timeline we are having right now, do you think the U.S. has already have the knowledge they do have, a general structure of how to approach with this North Korea-U.S. summit?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think so far, at least we have not seen much along this line, even though the latest news reports that the CIA Director Mike Pompeo, yes, secret visit to Pyongyang, seems that the administration, Trump administration, has been making serious work on preparing the visit, and of course it seems that it is more focused on the location and also I think the time. So the agenda issues, which is I think the most important issue people are looking at, seems that we don't have many news, but there are a lot of speculations whether they would be able out, what would become out.
What is more likely from the guessing coming from the Chinese side?
I think
given your knowledge of the
that's right. I
area.
think that possibly, I think the summit would be able to come up some statement, some agreement, framework, so that they would be able to guide the future talks. And that is, I think, why I guess countries like Japan are very much concerned that, because it seems that they are being left out, and also that they have little leverage to influence
the direction,
the direction of President Trump's sort of agenda for the talks.
That. What we know right now not only is coming from the tweet of President Trump, but also some of the words he said, Mr. Paul, at the press conference. He talked about the end of war, so-called, is having his quote, blessing. Meanwhile, a deal is also having, quote, blessing. Of course, we do not know exactly what is the meaning of blessing when it's coming from a U.S. president, which is a stakeholder in the whole issue. But what is your understanding of the words that he's been using? What does that mean, given your knowledge?
Well, my interpretation of what he had to say is that he has no objection in the upcoming meeting between the President of the Republic of Korea in the South and the leader of North Korea to discussing a peace treaty. This is okay. Maybe they've been well briefed by the Korean side in Seoul, and they feel that the ideas going forward for that meeting are not inconsistent with American interests. But questions are being raised. Does this mean a bilateral peace treaty? Well, is a bilateral peace treaty even possible when the armistice was signed not just by the two North and South Koreas, but also by China and the United States? There may have to be much more diplomacy to understand what the real meaning is.
Meanwhile, he also talked about the so-called denuclearization of Korean Peninsula is a good thing for the world, that's what he said. It's also good for North Korea as well. What do you think he is trying to say, President Trump, in his tweet? Of course, we could not exactly interpret all his thoughts at the same time, but the question is he trying to indicate something to the North Koreans about some promise that the U.S. would have if North Korea was trying to do something? Mr. Paul.
I think that the question of denuclearization is a huge question. We don't know what they mean by it. Now, there have been some press reports that are not, entirely consistent that perhaps Kim Jong-un is changing his whole approach to the use of nuclear weapons. However, there's a lot of indication from his behavior that he's not really changing his policies at all. And so what's hidden behind the veil of secrecy could be a source of real worry, or it could be what leads to the unfreezing of Northeast Asia's security dilemmas. It's a very momentous period when things could go very well or become extremely disappointing and add to the tensions in the region.
Mr. Rong, if the meeting takes place, the meeting takes place between North Korea and the United States when it comes to the summit. This is going to be the very first time since 2000. So that's been quite some years in between. Given the hard feelings two sides already had over the years, even though things could warm up, what should we have in mind if we're talking about the hope?
I think certainly I agree with Dr. Paul that we should be very careful in terms of the expectations. So managing the expectations certainly is I believe, is one of the most important things when we look at this forthcoming summit, if it did take place. But more importantly, what I'd emphasize is that we do have to have some hope. I can understand that a lot of skepticism about what would come out, particularly regarding the real intention of North Korea of this move, of this gesture. But I think unless and until we have the talks, we will not be able to tell what we can achieve. And the most important thing is that this gives us a very good opportunity to work out a long-term or lasting mechanism for peace, so that we can solve the problem, hopefully, for this on the peninsula and in the region.
All right, Mr. Paul, before we move on to the trade issue between Japan and the United States, I do want to push you a little bit more on this question as well. What about if you were being asked by the current administration inside Washington? Of course, I know there are a lot of hawkish individuals that is actually being asked about the vice when it comes to the Korean issue. But if you were asked, what do you think should be this roadmap that the United States should approach with if there were a summit between North Korea and the United States?
Well, I'll start by saying that you don't start with the heads of governments meeting and then work your way to the details. Usually you work your way through the details before you get to that meeting. However, we now face the fact that there's going to be a meeting, and it's a responsible thing to recommend how to make the best of it. And what we need in this meeting is a very clear statement of whatever your phrase is, whatever the meaning of denuclearization will be. The North has, in the past, teased us to think that denuclearization meant a real elimination of nuclear weapons. But in fact, that did not intend that at all. They wanted to strip the region of the alliance structures which have kept North Korea in check. And so this time it might be different. But the language being used by North Korea in public is not different. And the behavior pattern is not different from Kim Jong-un's own father's behavior back in 2000 in preparation for meeting with the southern leader Kim Dae-jung at that time. So there's a lot of reason to maintain that skeptical approach and to press. Now, I'm very much in favor of the Pompeo trip to North Korea, meeting with Kim Jong-un. He may have heard the words we need to hear in that meeting. That's a good channel, but it's not a sufficient channel. Eventually, you have to get this out in public for airing, to gain support from the people in the Congress, and you can't just keep it wrapped up, although it's necessary in the initial phase to try to have confidential discussions.
I see. The reason why we talk about the DPRK and the United States summit is because of the visit by the Japanese Prime Minister, it seems to be the timing that the U.S. side have in mind to get out all of this information. So that is one important aspect of this visit by the Japanese Prime Minister to Washington, to the United States. The other thing, of course, is the trade between the United States and Japan. Let me go to you, Mr. Kato. What about TPP? What about farming issue? Do you think the Prime Minister has resolved these issues during his trip this time?
Yes, I think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he wants to create a good relationship, personal relationship with Mr. Trump. Because now looking at trade issue or a North Korean issue, now Japan seems to be sidelined or marginalized a little bit. And Japanese government are always, worrying about being passing, by the big powers. So at this moment, first of all, Shinzo Abe doesn't want wants to give big pressure to Mr. Trump. So I think I do think on TPP or tariff issues, I think Shinzo Abe is not going to give big pressure on Mr. Trump. But at the same time, Shinzo Abe, he can reveal Japan is leading the free trade issue, multilateralism, and we can lead the TPP's negotiation. And if possible, the United States could be back in the future. But now we can do what we can do. But just keep communication and don't have any misconception or miscommunication on the North Korean issue or TPP issue.
I see.
So now that's why. Yeah, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is creating good relationship with Mr. Trump, and he wants Mr. Trump to like him. I think this is the main point for Mr. Abe.
Well, for Mr. Trump to like him or not, that has a lot of different factors, I guess, being played. Let me go to you, Mr. Paul. About the trade issue, the trade surplus between Japan and the United States has always been in the words of President Trump, but do you think there's any way that the two sides will come to any kinds of agreement? Will tariffs still go on?
Well, I think that the Japanese side has made a very smart move, and they've lowered the level at which they want to discuss these complicated issues with the U.S. to the vice ministerial level. They've appointed vice ministers of foreign affairs, trade, and finance to meet with their counterparts in the U.S. and to not have the conversation between Mr. Abe and Mr. Trump burdened by very technical details. This is going to be something that will take months to unwind. There are clearly different views within the Trump administration about how to approach these issues, and getting this resolved in one summit meeting is not likely to happen. I think Mr. Abe will have a message that these issues need to be addressed. You can't treat Japan not as an ally and yet expect all the benefits of an alliance. So there's going to be the point made, but I think the details will be left to others.
Okay, Mr. Rong, of course, one needs to see that Japan and China relationship over the past few weeks seems to be warming up. Remember, we were talking about this at the very beginning of this week. Chinese State Councilor Foreign Minister visiting Japan and had talks with his counterpart over there, as well as the Prime Minister. So this trip made by the Japanese Prime Minister to the United States is right after he's meeting with the Chinese side. Interesting, isn't it? How is the Chinese side reading the ultimate interest that is bringing Japan and the United States together? Is it about an alliance against China, or is it about something else? Mr. Rong.
Well, I think, of course, for Japan, I think manage its relationship with the United States is important. And of course, I think to have a stable and normal relationship with China is also as important as well. That's why we have seen early this week a very successful visit by the State Councilor Wang Yi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And I think of course the Japanese, it seems that it's at a difficult sort of a balance. I mean, how to make sure that its improvement of the relationship with China would also help it to strengthen or help manage its differences or problems with the United States. Some of them, of course, have been there, but some of them new. The trade issue, it seems that it is also complicated and may have some impact on the perception of the relationship, particularly from the Japanese side.
Right. Mr. Kato, here's the interesting thing. On the trade issue, China and Japan both are actually, quote-unquote, suffering from their own perspective, from the tariffs the United States trying to impose against these two countries because what the U.S. considers as important surplus. So it seems that the two countries have some common ground. But on the other hand, when it comes to strategic issues, when it comes to, of course, ally relationship, China-Japan is very different from Japan and the United States. So, Mr. Kato, when it comes to real choice of the Japanese Prime Minister, about what issues are important, what exactly is the message that you are reading here?
I think there is a basic consensus in Japan. We can develop the relationship with the United States and China simultaneously. Of course, you know, we and the United States are allies. It's different with the relation with China. But now we are strengthening the relation with the United States, but it is not contradicted with the relation with China. So this is our strategy, and this is what we need to manage and learn. So, and I think looking back to the tariff issue, I mean trade, I think now between U.S. and Japan, we had some experiences in the 1980s. So actually, even we can communicate something with China. So how to protect the multilateralism and free trade issue, and how to avoid the trade war. I think because this would be undermining the Japan's interest. I mean, if some trade war happens in Asia Pacific, so I think now we need to have some more communication. That's why I think it would be a smart approach for Mr. Abe to create a good relationship with Mr. Trump and promote something, you know, to avoid the trade war.
You know what? One of the most interesting things about today's world is everything is changing so fast. Thank you so much, the three of you, for helping us to understand all these nuances going on between the United States and Japan, and certainly with China also has a role to play. Thank you so much, Rong-Ying, Douglas Paul, Yoshikazu Kato. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.